Okay, I can see some people are joining us. Lots of people with us this morning. It's great. Okay, I'm going to start sharing my screen and then we'll get started. Okay, good morning, everyone. You're still just trickling in. That's okay. I'm just going to give a brief introduction for about 5 minutes before our guest gets started. So welcome to the Invasive Species Center's webinar series. Today we're presenting Weedbusters, the trials, tribulations, and toolbox of an invasive plant management practitioner. My name is Emily Postorero, and as a program development coordinator at the Invasive Species Center, I'm going to be your host and moderator for today. So you might know that the Invasive Species Center is based out of Sault Ste. Marie. However, I am presenting to you today from my home in the city of Oshawa. So I reside on the territory of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nation. And Oshawa is also home to many other First Nations people, Métis and Inuit. And for those of you who aren't as familiar with our organization, the Invasive Species Center is a not-for-profit. We connect stakeholders, knowledge, and technology to prevent the introduction and spread of invasive species that harm Canada's environment, economy, and society. If you've never been over to our website before, I would suggest popping over. We do have a lot of really great resources. So we have best management practices, databases. We have a number of detailed profiles of many different invasive species across different taxa. We also have video resources, including recordings of previous webinars like this one, okay? Also on our homepage, if you scroll down, you will be able to sign up for some correspondence from us. So you can sign up for our quarterly newsletter. You can see that there on the left, our biweekly media scan and event reminders. And that's where you would find out about future webinars like this one. So just before we get started with today's presentation, there's just a couple things I want to cover. There will be time for questions at the end of the webinar. So if you have a question at any time, you can just type it in that question box that you can kind of see in the bottom of your Zoom screen. And then I will read those questions out to the presenter at the end. Please don't use the raise hand function. We're just going to save all the questions for the end and we will have lots of time, okay? If you're having any technical difficulties, again, feel free to use that question and answer box. I'm going to be moderating it for the duration of the presentation, and we'll do our best to resolve any technical issues for you. There will be a very brief survey following this webinar. It should pop up after the presentation. If you can just take a few moments to fill that out, it would be much appreciated. It's just some feedback for us. It's also going to be in a follow-up email tomorrow if you prefer to fill it out then. And finally, the meeting is being recorded and it's going to be made available later on the Invasive Species Center website, invasivespeciescenter.ca. Okay, so I will finally introduce our presenter today. Welcome to Jenna LeBlanc. Jenna brings a lot of experience. She's worked as an invasive plant manager in Alberta across 5 different provincial parks and 3 different ecosystems. Her master's thesis surveyed invasive plant dynamics in riparian corridors in Ontario, and currently she's studying the restoration of Alberta's native prairies as a PhD student at York University. So she's studied invasive plants and their impacts for the last 5 years now as both a practitioner in the field and an invasion theory researcher. So happy to have you on today, and so I am going to now pass things over to Jenna.
Hi, sorry, I was muted there for a second. Hi, everyone. Thanks to Emily and the Invasive Species Center for having me. Thanks to everyone here for joining. Oh, didn't mean to go there. There we go. Yeah, I'm going to be talking, like Emily said, about the trials, tribulations, and toolbox of invasive plant manager. So sharing some of my experiences as an invasive plant manager, some of the I guess tips and tricks I've come up with both for how to think about invasive plant management and then sort of practical applications of those skills. So without further ado, I'll get started here. As a little overview, I'm just going to say a few words about myself and my work. And then I'm going to talk about what I call the practitioner mindset. So the things that I keep in mind and I try to consider when I'm out in the field making management decisions. And they're, I think general enough that anyone managing invasive plants could apply these to the environments that they're in. I'll talk about some of the tools of the trade, so both like the actual physical tools that you might use and some of the other tools you might have at your disposal for managing invasive plants. And then just talking about priorities and action plans, because I'm sure, as everyone knows, you can't manage every single invasive species out there. So knowing how to prioritize and what actions to take is also an important part of being an invasive plant manager. And I'll illustrate that with like a little case study from my experiences. So a little bit about me to start off with. So I have a Bachelor's of Science in Biology from St. Mary's University in Calgary, Alberta. I've got a Master's of Environmental Science from the University of Toronto. And career-wise, I've worn many different hats. I've had a number of environmental education roles, including on the right. You can see me dressed up as a wolf, teaching people about carnivores in Kananaskis country with Alberta Parks. I don't always work dressed as a wolf, but in that case I did. I've had a number of science communication roles as well. And then, of course, for our purposes today, I was a vegetation manager. Oh, and next slide here. Sorry. So in terms of my involvement with invasive species as a practitioner, so I worked as a vegetation manager with Alberta Parks from 2017 to 2018. And this is covering what we call the East Kananaskis region. So this is 5 different provincial parks around the Calgary area. So that's sort of south central Alberta, southwest Alberta. And this covered 3,000 hectares of parkland across mostly grassland, forest, and riparian habitat. In terms of my research experience with invasive species, so my master's thesis at the University of Toronto examined non-Indigenous plant species abundance in agricultural riparian buffers. So these are buffer zones established along waterways that are adjacent to agricultural land that help to filter runoff from agricultural fields and prevent erosion and help to protect the integrity of the water system. And so the vegetation there is a whole combination of different types of plants. So I carried out a number of vegetation surveys across 7 different sites to kind of categorize all the different plants there. And our findings basically were that non-Indigenous species are quite prevalent in these buffers. The impacts they're having on the functioning of the buffers is not quite apparent, but it's not a priority to manage them at this time necessarily. So this is me in the field with my research assistant, Stu, back in 2019. So my current research, I'm pursuing my PhD in biology at York University in Toronto. I am researching the ecology of rough fescue grasses and their associations with fungal mutualists called fungal endophytes, and hoping that learning about those organisms and their relationship might help us to restore rough fescue grasslands, which in Alberta are a threatened environment ecosystem. So I'm not directly studying invasive species in this case, but invasive grasses especially are a major threat to native grassland integrity. So they're always in consideration when you're doing this kind of restoration and conservation work. Okay, so I'm going to take a quick sip. And I'm going to start with what I call, I don't know, the practitioner mindset. So things to consider and ways of viewing the plants and the environment you're working in to best inform the actions that you're going to take when you're managing invasive plants. So number one would be to know thy enemy, which here just means to understand the characteristics and the life cycles of the invasive plants that you're going to be dealing with. Because, oh, didn't mean to go that far. There we go. Because the individual traits that a plant has are going to determine the best methods for managing it. So you've got things like the plant's life cycle, whether it's annual, biennial, perennial. That's going to help determine whether the plant is going to be a recurring problem or if it's just an annual plant you can dig up and it's gone the next year. A perennial plant might require repeated treatments or different kinds of treatments to manage. Its life cycle stage, so whether it's seedling, whether it's actually flowering, whether it's already gone to seed, is going to impact its treatments. So at different stages, the plant is going to be using its energy in different ways. It's metabolizing energy in different ways in order to grow or reproduce. And so, for example, some herbicides are only effective if you treat the plant before it starts flowering. And some herbicides are only effective if you treat the plant after it's flowering because they affect different metabolic pathways in different plant tissues. So knowing what stage the plant is at is going to obviously impact stuff like that. And then also the method of spread. So how the plant reproduces and spreads is going to affect its management. So if a plant reproduces using very abundant seeds like this nodding thistle here, stopping it from flowering or containing those seeds is probably going to be a top priority. But for example, if it spreads vegetatively, so it puts out rhizomes or creeping stems and makes clones of itself, then you're probably going to want to target the root system instead because the seeds might not be its primary method of reproduction. So knowing thy enemy in practice, so in practice, what this looks like is if you've got two different plants that actually look quite similar, but are very different life cycles and reproductive methods. So for example, here you've got a burdock. Burdock is a biennial plant. So in its first year, it produces a rosette of leaves. And then in the next year, it goes to flower. It flowers and then goes to seed, and then that's the end of its life cycle. It spreads via hooked seeds. So if you've ever seen a burdock, you know it's got those very obvious burrs, and it's got one long taproot that's connected to a single plant. On the right, we've got creeping thistle, Cirsium arvens. So this is a perennial plant. It comes back every year, even if it's reproduced that year. It spreads via airborne seeds, but it also spreads extensively through rhizomes. So it's got these laterally spreading roots and it pops up multiple clones of itself. So this group of plants you see in the picture here is actually probably one plant that's connected by an underground root system. So in terms of treatment then, you're going to treat these very differently. With a burdock, if you just dig it up before the seed set, you cut off that taproot, it's not going to have enough energy to regrow. And if it happens to have gone to seed and the seeds are already set, all you have to do is clip off those seed heads, contain them in a bag and dispose of them properly. And the remaining plant tissue isn't going to make more flowers and more seeds the next year because it's a biennial. In terms of Cirsium arvens, so creeping thistle, you definitely can't dig these guys up. They've got those extensive root systems. They can regrow from a fragment of root about the size of the end of your thumb. They're very persistent. and it's just going to keep coming back year after year if you're trying to dig it up. So herbicide is really the most effective way of treating a plant like this. And like I mentioned before, you can only really treat it if it's before it's gone to flower. So you can spray it with herbicide. After it's flowered, unfortunately, the only sort of management thing you could do for creeping thistle is to mow it, which will at least prevent it from going to seed, slow it down a little bit, and then hopefully get you some time until you can treat it with herbicide the next year. So number 2 in your practitioner mindset would be to know the environment. So knowing the characteristics of the habitat you're working in, because that's going to affect what plants are growing there and what management actions you can take. So in terms of, like the environmental characteristics, you've got stuff like the availability of resources. So the level of water, the level of sunlight, the level of nutrients, how much space is available. Also the amount of disturbance that goes on in that habitat. So how frequently and drastically these environmental conditions are shifting, how often is new space being opened up by something like fire or flood or erosion, things like that. And also where the sources of new seeds and new plants are coming from. So if you're next to a major waterway, that's a really excellent source of incoming seeds. If it's near pathways, if there's frequent visitor traffic through the area, that's also going to maybe be a new seed source. So knowing the characteristics of the environment and how the seeds are getting there and how the plants might be interacting with their environment is going to affect how you might manage them. So for example, if you're looking at a riparian habitat, has got abundant water, abundant nutrients. There's lots of runoff bringing, thanks. But there's going to be relatively limited light and space. So there's quite a lot of competition and crowding. The plants are popping up, they grow quite fast. So space and light are going to be limiting. There's also very frequent disturbance. So there's lots of runoff coming in. The riverbank is prone to flooding. There's erosion happening. Space is being opened up pretty quickly. And seeds are being introduced either by air or, of course, by water. So the river is going to be a major source of seed input. So common invaders that you get around riparian zones would be things that are fast growing. So they're taking advantage of free space whenever it comes available, shade and flood tolerant because they're going to be constantly buffeted by water, and also there's probably going to be a lot of crowding, and often trees grow around riparian zones as well. And also things that create very abundant seeds, because the river is a very easy method for transporting seeds to new places. And if you've got such high levels of competition, the numbers game really matters. So putting out hundreds or thousands of seeds that can be carried away and germinate very easily is going to be give you the edge in a riparian environment. So if we contrast that to a grassland ecosystem, for example, a grassland has very limited water and nutrients, but it has abundant light and space. So there's plenty of sunlight, quite a lot of open ground, but not a ton of water and nutrients to take advantage of. There is infrequent disturbance. So in a grassland, you've got things like grazing, you've got fires, but they're especially in more managed environments, those aren't happening all that often. And seeds are being introduced by air or also by animals quite commonly. And so invasive species that you find in an ecosystem like this are often going to be drought tolerant. So they can withstand limited water input. And they're going to have deep roots usually in order to take advantage of the water that they can find. And also something we see quite frequently is that these plants tend to spread using rhizomes and creeping roots rather than seed primarily, because conditions in a grassland especially in the early spring, can be very dry and very cold. Seed germination can be hampered. If you can just spread vegetatively through rhizomes and pop up new plants, rather than relying on good germination conditions, an invasive plant like that is going to have much bigger advantages than one that relies on seeds. So different conditions, different invasive plants, different ways that those plants interact with those environments. So in terms of in practice, so this is a little mini case study at Glenbow Ranch Provincial Park, which is one of the provincial parks I managed in. So this in the picture here is Dalmatian toadflax. It's related to yellow or common toadflax, Linaria vulgaris. This one is Linaria dalmatica. We're not 100% sure where this original seed came from, but it was very isolated to one spot in the park on a very dry, exposed slope. So it's a rather harsh environment. So it was expanding year over year, but it wasn't popping up in different areas in the park. So herbicide application here would be quite damaging. These plants popped up in a relatively intact native grassland community, and it's also on a slope. So if you spray this with herbicide, you're not only impacting the native plants right in the area, but you might also get runoff down the slope to the plants that are down at the bottom of the slope. So knowing that these plants are in one isolated patch, herbicide would probably damage the surrounding environment, and that these plants are relying on relatively limited resources in the soil. We just decided to hand pull it, which was a bit tedious, but if you just kept coming back, we pulled the new plants as they emerged. Eventually that root system got so exhausted and didn't have enough resources to replenish itself fast enough that the infestation just went away after a while, because we had exhausted it thoroughly. So my number 3 for the practitioner mindset is to know thy neighbors, which just means knowing who is in the community around you and the site that you're working in, who might be interested in or affected by the actions you're taking, and also how their actions might impact your site. So for example, the community and the landscapes surrounding a site can impact your management decisions. So there may be invasive plants on private property that you don't have access to that could spread into the park or the site that you're working on. There's also, if it's something like a public park, you've got hiking boots and pets as pictured here that are a very good source of incoming or outgoing invasive plant seeds. And then on a personal level, people might have concerns about herbicides. They might have concerns about other management activities that you're going to want to spend some time explaining or maybe avoid if the community is particularly concerned about that. But also there's some positives to having an involved community around you. It's a good source of potentially, volunteers for weed pulls if they're interested in helping manage invasive plants. And also things like, informational sessions or pamphlets, things like that, and kind of getting the word out and getting more people on board with knowing about invasive species and how you're managing them in the space that you're working in. So just as a couple examples to illustrate this. So Fish Creek Park is one of the parks that I worked in. It's an urban green space, and it's kind of surrounded on all sides by private homes with gardens. It's very full of public hiking paths. So people use this space a lot, and people's adjacent properties are right up against the park. So you've got a community who overall is quite supportive of management actions in the park, but some of them might be a little concerned about, if there's herbicide application or why we're digging up certain plants and not others. They might be unaware of the impacts of invasive species. And we've definitely had some interesting interactions where folks with their backyards right up against the park were inadvertently harboring invasive species that were spreading in. And we had to have some conversations with community members to let them know that was happening. And then sort of on the maybe opposite side. So if you're looking at something like a riparian agricultural buffer, which I've worked in. So this is a relatively small site. It's private access only. It's private agricultural land. but it's bordered on all sides by these major roadways and these agricultural fields. So it's already a relatively intensely managed site. And so while we found non-native species in here, there's very little risk of them disturbing any sort of pristine native habitat. And the purpose of this, and the reason why the farmer wants this on their property in the first place, is to just help filter the runoff from the agricultural fields and to prevent erosion. So coming into this site and ripping up all of the invasive species here, it would be rather foolish. There's not really any management action here that is going to help the environment more than it kind of helps the person who has it on their property in the first place. So moving on to talk about some of the tools of the trade. So these are both, physical tools and also, I guess, digital or social tools that you can use. And again, these are the tools that I relied on most frequently when I was a practitioner. I'm sure every practitioner has their own sort of set of preferred tools, but these are from my experience. So a lot of vegetation management is pulling up or digging up invasive plants. So having a sturdy shovel is pretty essential. And actually these sort of narrow transplant shovels here are quite useful because you can really target the root system of a plant. You can pull it up and you don't leave a big hole in the ground in the surrounding area. So these ones are quite useful. Clippers as well, like pruning shears, are very useful because a lot of management sometimes is just snipping off flowers or seeds to prevent a plant from going to seed and just bagging it and transporting it off site, which also means that very sturdy garbage bags are essential. A lot of the time you're packing out a lot of the vegetation material that you take down. I don't know how many pounds of invasive plant material I've hauled in my life, but I do know one day we did a volunteer weed pull where we collected about 200 pounds of invasive plant material, and we had to load it all up into a giant truck. So sturdy bags and, some decent arm strength are also very useful tools to have. And I put a picture of hiking boots here, but really like a full set of good outdoor clothes is going to be your friend because you're working outside, you're working in in the midst of a lot of vegetation. So you're going to want good solid shoes, long sleeves, good hiking pants, things that'll keep you cool when it's hot, things that'll keep you dry if it's raining, and things that'll keep you warm if it's cold. There's also a number of tools. So herbicide application is a pretty major component of the job as well. So there's specific tools and equipment for that. The picture on the left, it's a little difficult to see, but I'm sitting in our little side-by-side all-terrain vehicle. And so this was really handy for getting to remote areas pretty quickly. And it's also outfitted with a 400-liter tank connected to a gas-powered pump. And that can either power like a handheld sprayer for targeted herbicide application, or there is a mechanical sprayer on the back for more widespread application. There's also a rack with all of our tools and such on the back. Then on the right here, you see these backpack type sprayers. These are useful if you want to do small scale, smaller amounts of herbicide, targeted applications, or areas where you can't access them with a vehicle, for example. And then of course, there's the associated personal protective equipment. So you always want long sleeves, long pant legs. You're going to have to use chemical resistant gloves and boots to prevent contact with your skin. And the gentleman on the right is not displaying this, but you always want to have eye protection as well. Oops, I went backwards. I meant to go forwards. There we go. So these are additional tools that are very helpful if you are managing, especially like I did, over a very large area and over multiple years. Having some sort of database or GPS tracking system for keeping track of all of the invasive plants is very useful. So we would go out into the field. If we found a new instance of an invasive plant, we'd create a new data point for it, where it is, what species, any additional notes. And then we would visit up and follow up on, oh, thanks. We would follow up on years previous, the invasions that we had found before, to see if they're growing, if they're spreading anywhere new, if they're shrinking, if our management had impacted them, positively or negatively. And then also things like identification guides and information guides. You get pretty familiar with the plants and the species that you are managing, but these types of guides usually have useful insights about, best management practices, or maybe the origins or the current known range of the plants. So if you're on the edge of a plant's range and you're seeing it in your site now, it might be important to report that to the appropriate authorities. Okay, and then I wanted to also talk a little bit about some vegetation management animal allies. It's kind of a strange subsection, but I've actually been able to work with some very cool creatures that assist in finding and managing invasive species. So I wanted to discuss those as well. So pictured here is the hound's tongue root weevil, Mogulones crucifer, which I have worked with in the parks as well, which is a biocontrol agent that helps manage hound's tongue. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in this next slide here. Right, so biocontrol is the use and the release of specialized insects for targeted management of invasive plants. And they work with a number of different mechanisms. So some of them just eat the roots and leaves of the plant, and that weakens the plant. Some of them specifically target the flowers and the seed heads, which prevents the plant from reproducing. Some of them deposit eggs in the plant's tissue, which further weakens the plant as well. And so the pros of this using biocontrol is that it's a very hands-off application. So once you release these insects, they go where they need to go, they do their thing, and you don't necessarily have to worry about managing that species anymore. It's highly targeted. So these are very specialized insects that go after very specific invasive plants. You don't have to go in there and, inadvertently spray herbicide on non-target plants. You don't have to create disturbance by digging up other plants around them. Some of the cons, though, unfortunately, biocontrol is it's very expensive, actually. So it's intensive research, like 5 to 10 years, in order to properly research some of these agents and to get them ready for practical application in the field. And there's also limited effectiveness. So if you have a very large, widespread invasion, you can release biocontrol agents, but they can only eat so much plant material. And sometimes it will help to weaken or slow the growth of the plant, but won't actually eliminate them outright. So biocontrol is a really cool, useful tool, but it's usually in conjunction with other management activities. And then a sort of lesser known animal ally, at least in Alberta, is these conservation canine units. So there's an organization, this is in the United States, but Working Dogs for Conservation, who trains working dogs to identify and locate invasive species. So both invasive plant species and, for example, invasive aquatic species like zebra mussels and quagga mussels. So in the park that I worked in, there's an invasive plant pictured on the left here, Thesium ramosum. It's relatively new and mysterious. We're not exactly sure what the effects of it are fully, but especially in areas like the tall grass you see in the picture on the right, it's almost impossible to find if it's not flowering. And so these dogs, this is Seuss, the sniffer dog, he knows how to identify Thesium by smell. And basically, we walk with a team of these dogs through the park, and we're able to locate patches of these otherwise hidden invasive plants and kind of tag them to determine if we need to manage them or not. So these dogs are a very useful tool. Again, a sort of specific and limited application, but kind of another useful ally in the fight against invasive species. So I wanted to sort of finish off here by talking about priorities and action plans. So the unfortunate reality, of course, as most practitioners will know, is that you cannot manage every invasive species for logistical reasons, time reasons, multitude of other reasons. So unfortunately, you do have to pick and choose where you're going to target your management activities. And so there's ways of prioritizing and choosing what action is appropriate for the situation that hopefully will help kind of maximize the positive impact that you can have. Right, so this is Stu helping me monitor invasive plants in Southern Ontario. But in terms of priorities, there we go. Right, so not every plant invasion can be managed to your liking, especially in a place, unfortunately, like Alberta, where the parks budgets have recently been cut quite significantly. There's very limited, manpower on the ground to actually do a lot of the management activities. So it's necessary to prioritize in order to have the most impact. So some influencing factors for where your priorities might lie. At least in Alberta, there actually might be provincial regulations of which species you have to go after first. So we have two categories of invasive species in the province of Alberta. There's noxious weeds, which are more widespread. They've been identified in the province for a while. They have the potential to cause significant ecological or economic damage, but they're at a point where eradication of them is very unlikely. So the provincial sort of legal mandate is that you're legally obligated to prevent them from spreading to adjacent property. So if we're working in a park and we see, for example, pictured here, oxeye daisy, this is very hard to fully eradicate from a habitat. So all we have to do really, or all we are kind of obligated to do, is to prevent it from spreading to adjacent properties. Whereas the second category, the prohibited noxious weeds, are things that have been deemed new or exceptionally destructive, and are more likely to be contained and fully eradicated with targeted management actions. And so legally, we are mandated to destroy these plants completely wherever we find them. And so that includes if we see them on someone else's property, we have to report them in order for the proper management to be taken care of. So I know that, for example, in the picture here, purple loosestrife is more widespread in Ontario, but it's a new and novel or not particularly common invader in Alberta. And so the legal obligation there is if you find purple loosestrife, your new priority is to target and destroy it as completely as possible. The next influencing factor would be early detection, rapid response. So I know the Invasive Species Center actually has a whole kind of group mandate surrounding this, which is really cool. But it basically means that the most effective management will be if something is detected early, and then if you quickly respond to that, and that's going to give you the best chance of getting it under control rather than letting it grow out of control and then retroactively trying to manage that. So if we're in a park and we see, for example, a small patch emerging of a new invasive species, even though it's relatively small, we might have larger problems in other areas of the park. If we can do targeted rapid action against that invasive species, it's going to save us a lot of trouble down the line. So that would be a next priority. And then a final influencing factor would be proximity to pristine habitat. So there are cases where you may have similarly sized infestations of the same plant, but one is, adjacent to a parking lot and a number of park paths, and one is adjacent to maybe some very pristine, intact native grassland habitat. Although you do want to get stuff near the parking lot under control, the impact If the invasive was to spread into that other area of, more pristine habitat, would be ecologically more significant. So that might be your priority to control it there. And of course, that completely depends on a number of different factors and the things we discussed earlier, what kind of plant it is, environmental characteristics. So it's not a cut and dry, but those are some factors that might influence how you prioritize your management actions. Then, so to kind of, I guess, bring all this together and into a little concise example for taking the practitioner mindset into account, using the tools available to us, and then making an action decision. I'll talk about a little case study here that I dealt with personally, where we decided that inaction for the time being was actually the best action. So, so this took place in Fish Creek Provincial Park, which is in Calgary, so southern Alberta. It's a mix of different habitats. So there's forest, there's riparian areas. This area in particular was sort of a little mini grassland with some wetlands scattered throughout. And what we discovered was a spotted knapweed infestation. Spotted knapweed being a very aggressive and difficult to deal with invasive species, especially in drier habitats like these sort of grassy areas in Alberta. And it was kind of found within this little island of trees. So it was a very strange, isolated infestation of spotted knapweed in this tree island. We believe that it was probably spread in from the adjacent golf course. So sometimes golf courses unwittingly use invasive or noxious species as gardening. Regardless, it had spread relatively, it was spread fairly extensively through this little tree island, but it was isolated from the park paths and other avenues of spread. So because this golf course is private property and the path, you can kind of see it coming in from the top left corner and going down through the right middle. There wasn't really any chance for it to be spread by people because people weren't really going to this little tree island. But we wanted to take some action against it anyways, because spotted knapweed is one of the, I believe, still prohibited noxious species in Alberta. But unfortunately, the environmental characteristics made management very difficult. So the trees, the fact that it was in amongst the trees prevented herbicide application, because applying herbicide right around the roots of trees can kill the trees as well. So what we decided to do, because it was a fairly extensive infestation, was to use park volunteers to hand pull the plants. So we would go to this little isolated island of trees, we would pull the spotted knapweed out by hand, we would bag it, we would carry it off the site. And we did this 3 years in a row with this same group of volunteers. But the unintended consequences of this, unfortunately, was that actually by increasing traffic to this area, by introducing a number of volunteers, we were actually spreading the knapweed further than it was naturally progressing. So we started seeing it pop up along the path now, where before it had just been isolated to the island. And there was sort of almost a trail of knapweed in between this little island and the path. And while we had tried to be very careful to isolate the seeds, to wash down and brush off everyone's clothing before and after, it obviously increasing the traffic to the area was increasing the spread of the knapweed around this area. So unfortunately, we saw that there was now even further risk of this spreading. If it got all the way to the river, the seeds could be carried downstream, which has worse consequences, and also impacting these wetland areas around, because this habitat had been reconstructed. It was a really good source for migrating birds. We were actually kind of unintentionally making the situation worse by trying to manage for the knapweed. So our new plan of action, in fact, was to stop management action because the hand pulling was ineffective and it was worsening the situation. And so basically the management, given the combination of environmental and logistical factors, we decided the best thing we could do was to keep the knapweed contained by, treating the surrounding area with herbicide whenever it was encountered outside of this little tree island, but otherwise kind of just letting it do its thing there. Because unfortunately, it was a tough situation, but that's what we ended up doing. I have not been able to check in on how it's progressed since I left, but that was where we kind of left it off. And again, kind of shows you that it's unfortunate, but given the combination of scenarios, sometimes the relative inaction was actually a better option than the action we were taking. So in terms of just my concluding remarks then, you can see obviously that invasive plant management is a combination of a lot of different kinds of knowledge. So knowledge of your plants, knowledge of the environment, social and community knowledge, and the actions that you take depend on a lot of different environmental and logistical factors. And unfortunately, as we've seen, you can't really win every battle. There's just not enough time and money, unfortunately. So you do your best where you can, and you try to recruit allies along the way. So and by allies, I mean, community members who are interested in this. The more you can sort of share this knowledge and share with other people, the less of the individual burden it is on the specific vegetation management practitioner. So I hope that, this has sparked some maybe different thinking about this matter, that you found it interesting. And thank you for allowing me to share my experiences with you. I just wanted to also say thanks to the Invasive Species Center for hosting me and Emily for organizing the webinar, to Blake Weiss, who was my management partner and my mentor through a lot of my vegetation management practitioner training, and also to Stu Livingstone, who was my assistant in the field when I was doing my master's work and had a lot of insight about invasive species and invasive species management. And I'll pass that back over to Emily, and I'd be happy to take any questions. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Jenna. Sorry, I'm just going to kind of come back in here. Oh, there we go. Okay, yeah, thank you. We do have a number of questions. Also, just quickly, thank you to everyone for your patience. The handful of times that the slides mysteriously jumped forward, that was me. It's a bit tricky to kind of have two people controlling a screen at the same time, so it happens, but Jenna did a great job, and yeah, thanks for your patience with that. I am going to start going through these questions now. Let's see. So one audience member says that I got myself into some troubles after receiving a truckload of free wood chips last fall, in addition to dealing with the garlic mustard that has started to appear in my backyard. The shredded chips started to sprout this past spring. I did a search using a plant app to ID, and they appeared to be buckthorn. Do you know if there are any effective ways to deal with them? If they are in fact buckthorn, are there any rules that arborists have to follow with regards to spreading that invasive species?
Ooh, okay, good question. I have not personally worked with buckthorn or the regulations about it in Ontario. In my experience, dealing with woody species is most effective, at least for the ones I've worked with, in we like clipping and painting, we call it. So you get a woody species specific I believe it's called Garlon is its commercial name. I'm not sure if it's publicly available, but you can, oh, there we go. Yes, thanks. Someone said Garlon 4. You can trim the stumps and then apply the herbicide to the exposed stumps, and it'll get transported down to the roots. And usually that's relatively effective. Though again, sorry, I haven't worked with buckthorn specifically, so you may have to look up what the regulations around that or the targeted herbicide might be.
Okay, thank you. I just want to remind folks as well, if you have like a specific question that you want answered, try to put it in the Q&A as opposed to the chat bubble. I know it's a little confusing and I didn't clarify between the two. I am going between both chats so that we can try and get everything in, but just if you can try and keep it within the Q&A. Okay, so the next one, what precautions did you take so you don't transfer invasive species that might attach to your clothes and boots?
Yeah, so we had a little kit usually in the field that included, I don't know if anyone is familiar with working with horses, but there's these combination like hoof pick / brushes actually, and they're very good for invasive species management. So if you get mud stuck in your boots, you can scrape the mud out with the hook side, and then the brush is really good for brushing them out of your shoelaces and such. And we would usually we were working with species that, or we would rather try to get to the species before the seeds had set, but you can also do things like put the bag over top of the entire plant to contain the seeds, cut it off at the bottom and tie it up rather than trying to transfer from the bag. So there's, you know, a number of different things, but in terms of clothes and boots, carrying a little brush around you to brush yourself off and pick the mud out of your shoes at the site before you leave, and then rinsing down your boots before you go back in can be a useful way of managing that.
Okay, thank you. And on that note, I'm going to bounce back to another question that was asked. Do you know how long it takes for an invasive species? I think this user specifically asked about garlic mustard, but how long something has to be in a bag for it to be, you know, killed in the bag, in a plastic garbage bag?
Oh, garlic mustard, I'm not 100% sure. So like garlic mustard, I know actually has very long-lived seeds. So it's not necessarily the amount of time until it's safe to put it in the regular garbage, but we actually, we would bag them for special disposal. So they would actually get transported to a place that would incinerate them and fully destroy the seeds. And in terms of the plant, so some of the plants, if they're close to flowering or going to seed and you cut them down and you just leave them on the ground, they can actually complete their life cycle and go to seed anyways. So like the best precaution, I guess, if you don't have access to like a full incinerating disposal would be to, yeah, isolate the seeds, like put it in a bag, wait until it's completely desiccated and dead. And if there's any remaining seeds, yeah, the best thing would not to be to put it in like a commercial waste disposal and maybe instead like burn it. But I don't know if that's very practical for folks who don't have access to the kind of like industrial level incineration that we were sending it to.
Right, okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, a few people kind of asked similar questions about
Mm-hmm.
sort of how to get rid of it, but yeah, it is tricky for just the average gardener maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Would you be able to talk about the treatment of rhizomatous perennials without herbicide? I know you used herbicide for some plant species.
Without herbicide, it's really difficult is the unfortunate reality, because they are rhizomatous, they have the ability often to resprout from even small, someone's putting in the chat, but yeah, even small pieces. So even if you go and you dig up an entire plant, if you leave behind a single root fragment of, for example, creeping thistle, it will sprout back up again eventually and continue to spread. So that's why we use herbicide for those types of perennial rhizomatous plants, because it systematically gets throughout the entire plant. If you're trying to treat them without it, certain plants, so for example, like toad flax that we dealt with a lot, does have a shallow enough root system that, again, if you pull it by hand, like repeatedly, you can eventually exhaust the root system to the point where it doesn't regrow. Other things are more like just managing it year over year to prevent it from spreading too far. So keeping it consistently mown before it can go to seed and kind of exhausting some of its energy, or, you know, clipping it, or the other thing would be Biocontrol, which is not unfortunately available to like a private citizen, but Biocontrol would be the other thing that is a non-herbicide targeted application. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, good to know. And just a reminder too, just because I am seeing a lot of questions about kind of specific invasive species, and we won't get to all of them, but our website, the invasivespeciescenter.ca, it does have a best management practices database. And we do have a lot of stuff on there. So I would suggest checking out that database, see if the species you have questions about is on there. And that might help some of the folks asking more specific questions about certain species. I'm sorry we can't get to every single one of them. Yeah, we still have some time. I'm going to keep going through some more of these. One of the attendees is curious about the invasive species detection dogs. Do you know how extensively they're used? Obviously, they're used in Alberta. Do you know if they're used maybe like in other provinces in Canada, or where this practice originated?
Yeah, I believe so. Those dogs would travel through. They were used in at least Alberta and Saskatchewan, like the same team. And originally they were trained in Montana. So I believe the States utilizes it as well. I had not heard of them in other provinces, though there might be similar programs. Yeah, these guys specifically were actually originally used for the detection of zebra and quagga mussels, because they aren't as widespread in the prairie provinces as they are out east here. So they were sort of almost like a border control for detection between Alberta and Saskatchewan is primarily where they operated. And then we use them specifically in our parks in Alberta as well.
Okay, yeah, interesting. This is actually the first time I'm hearing of using dogs for that purpose. So that is very cool.
Yeah, it's a pretty fun program.
Someone had a question more for, I guess, more on a personal level. How did you get involved with invasive species management? Are there any programs or training resources you'd recommend for folks who are interested in pursuing this line of work?
Ooh, yeah, I guess. So I specifically got involved because I was working with Alberta Parks in like a landscaping capacity. So I was doing like cleanup around some of the recreational facilities. And then that kind of got me into knowing that there was like a separate invasive plant team. So I got involved through my involvement with the parks. So I guess that would be my advice, I guess, if you're looking to get started with either, I mean, there's also organizations like the Invasive Species Center who might have resources about that kind of stuff. But yeah, usually like a municipal or a provincial park level will have some sort of management strategy for invasive species that if you are able to contact those folks or check if they've got any job postings, that would be my advice. Oh, and someone, it looks like, has put some training into the chat there as well. So yeah, sorry, I don't have any more specific advice. Mine was specifically because I was already kind of working with the parks.
Yeah, I think a lot of us in the field can relate to just kind of finding ourselves involved somehow.
Yeah, and here I am to this day, so.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, if folks want to like check out that chat, we do have like a link to that best management practices database that I mentioned. And yeah, other people are just really popping off in here and suggesting some good resources. So if anyone wants to just take a look. Okay, we're running out of time for questions. I'm going to try and get through maybe one more. Someone asked, do you recommend invasive species management in areas where dangerous fungi may be present, with the concern specifically here being blastomycosis? Do you know anything about that?
Oh, wow. I do not, unfortunately. I'm not sure if they mean the fungi are the invasive species, or taking action against the invasive species might put you at risk of fungal exposure. I mean, number one thing would be to ensure your own safety. Obviously, you don't want to put yourself in a dangerous situation just in order to manage invasive species. But yeah, I'm not actually familiar with that. I'm sorry. I don't have anything, any advice there.
Okay. Okay, maybe we'll try to use one more quick one. Yeah, a couple of people have just kind of asked about like other effective practices, like planting native species that are aggressive around invasive plants, or using goats. Do you know of any kind of other maybe unconventional, or like natural biological controls like that work?
Goats, actually, we've got quite an extensive, in Calgary, where I'm from originally, there's a very extensive goat weed management program, which is kind of cool. The thing about goats or anything else that is just eating invasive species, especially if it's because they'll eat pretty much anything, but if it's an aggressive rhizomatic perennial species, again, you get the problem where just eating the top growth won't prevent the plant from coming back. So it needs to be a repeated kind of constant application. But obviously, like anything that kind of keeps them a bit more under control is effective. Yeah, planting aggressive species. I know goldenrods I've seen, at least in Alberta, are like a pretty effective, I guess, defensive plant against a lot of invasive species. So picking native plants that have similar traits to the invasive plants. So if the invasive plant you're trying to combat is, drought tolerant with deep roots and rhizomatous, then planting something that's similar might be good. Or, if it's like a fast growing annual that produces a ton of seeds, then having a fast growing annual of your own that produces a ton of seeds will help kind of, provide a little competitive niche against the invasive species.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Good to know. All right. I think that is all the questions we have time for. We're going a little bit past noon. So I did just want to, there we go. Yeah, so of course, we are going to wrap up now. Thank you so much, Jenna, for presenting today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you're welcome. And for answering all those questions. It was a really great presentation. Thanks to all of you as well for tuning in. Really appreciate the audience, and everyone was really participatory today, which was fantastic to see. Thanks for folks who shared some resources in the chat as well. Those are wonderful. As I mentioned, this webinar was recorded, so if you miss anything or want to review it, it'll be posted on our website, invasivespeciescenter.ca shortly. And again, just a reminder, please fill out the survey if you are able to. It should pop up after I close off the webinar, but also it'll be in your email that you'll get just a follow-up email tomorrow. It's just some feedback on the webinar. We would much appreciate it. And our next webinar is going to take place on December 2nd at 7 o'clock at night. That one is going to be concerning e-commerce. Looks like it'll be pretty interesting, and you can register for that on our website as well. Okay, thanks so much, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.